Ahoy! Today we're talking about something that I think a lot of you will be really excited about and some of you may be a little bit sad about. And that is more Tsukuyomi nerfs. Now if you recall, Tsukuyomi already got a bunch of nerfs in patch 7.8 in the bonus balance. The scaling on his 1 Dark Moon Shuriken was decreased, the base damage on his 2 Kusari Gamma was reduced across all hits, the disarm duration was reduced, the base damage on the 3 Silver Moon Caltrops was reduced, and the base damage on the ultimate was reduced. So a lot of different damage values that were reduced in the previous patch. But yesterday it was announced that he's actually going to receive more nerfs. And when I say massive, I mean massive. Like, they're ripping this guy apart. So these nerfs will be happening in patch 7.9, meaning you won't have to wait long for them. They're labeled as post-PTS balance changes, but honestly I don't think they're really affected by the PTS stats. I doubt anyone even played PTS at that time. I think they're more affected by how he's been performing since his initial nerfs. As you may remember, I said after his initial nerfs that I would not expect them to be enough based on certain interactions that he has still, and that I would think that he would get some nerfs further down the line to put him more in line. And having played Tsukuyomi a fair bit since the nerf, and also having played against a lot of Tsukuyomis, I can say that he most certainly still has very, very high damage output. If you look at the end game screen, where you see the damage, Tsukuyomi is frequently very high up there, even if he didn't perform particularly well in the game. It's just the nature of his kit that he deals massive amount of damage, because he has 4 damaging abilities that reliably can hit multiple enemies between his ultimate and also his 3, which is often undervalued in that regard. So overall, he just deals a ton of damage. Now, what Hi-Rez is targeting with the nerfs this time is partially the damage, but not only the damage. The things that remain entirely untouched are Tsukuyomi's passive and his 1. I expect that they want the 1 to remain one of his stronger abilities because it is basically the most unique mechanic that he has overall. So you can also keep slowing with that and everything else. That's pretty much his bread and butter skill, I suppose. His second ability, Kusarigama, however, gets a lot of nerfs. The swing damage scaling per swing is reduced from 50% to 35%. The final damage scaling is reduced from 80% to 70%. That means the total scaling is decreased from 180% to 140%. Now keep in mind, this scaling value does sound like a lot, but it also means that during these swings he cannot basic attack. So he will now have less scaling overall than if he was just spamming basics in the same time frame, but at the same time this ability allows you to get closer to enemies with more movement speed, so that kind of makes sense. The disarm duration is decreased from 1.6 seconds up to 2 seconds, down to 1 second at all ranks. I think this is honestly a very good change. Tsukuyomi's disarm mechanic makes sense in the context of what weapon he is using for this ability, and it's also a way for him to somewhat deal with close range basic attackers, because he doesn't have all too many means to get away from them or otherwise cope with them, I would say. But I also thought that the 2-second duration was way too long, especially if you miss the stun afterwards. You still have significantly less of a threat fighting into any AA guard because they're disarmed for so long that you can put out a lot of damage in the meantime, and they can often be enough to turn a fight. Now with 1 second instead, you really want to make sure that you confirm the last hit, which is not as easy to confirm as the first 2, in order to get the stun to get the full effectiveness, and otherwise you may get punished for that. So this increases his skill floor, and I think that is a very good thing that he needs because he is just too easy to play overall. The next change, decreased movement speed while channeling from 33% to 25%. Also something that I think is fine. It's not a massive decrease, you will notice it a little bit, but at the same time he still gets a movement speed increase and he has other ways to increase movement speed. That's just a minor detail and makes it a bit less of an effective escape as well, which I think is fair. The last change here is Tsukuyomi can now be knocked up during this ability. I probably don't even need to tell you this, but this is an absolutely massive change. Knockups implies knockbacks as well, which means that basically any hard CC will now disrupt Tsukuyomi's 2. If you have played Tsukuyomi and faced a guard that utilizes a stun or silence, and you have been disrupted while using a 2, then you may have noticed what a massive difference it makes in damage. It's a bit awkward because at the moment it kind of sometimes resets and allows you to use the ability again. They didn't actually mention fixing this, but I'm assuming this is going to be fixed along with that. But if you lose the damage from that ability, then your damage is almost cut in half, because a lot of damage is loaded into its ability and will still be even after the scaling nerf, because the base damage is still high. Now it's going to be harder to find the guards that don't at least have some way to disrupt Tsukuyomi's 2, instead of those that have a way to disrupt it. It's going to be very, very hard for him to get this ability through, and while I think it still has some value leveling this because of the increased damage as well as the increased stun duration, there may be many situations where Tsukuyomi players will still opt into leveling the 1 over the 2, just based on the fact that the 2 will be interrupted most of the time when you use it. This fundamentally changes how this ability works, and it's very unusual based on other channeled abilities. Like think of Thor's 3, think of Guan Yu's 3. They all have this channeling that also allows them to specifically counter knockups, which is something that greatly helps them in teamfights. But the nerfs don't end there. Silver Moon Caltrops also gets a further nerf. The scaling is decreased from 25% to 20%. That may not necessarily sound like much, but it does have a fair bit of an impact considering he builds relatively high power, and you often have multiple enemies who have to get through these Caltrops and take multiple ticks from them, so it adds up. Like I said, this ability I think adds quite drastically to his overall damage output and is a little bit overlooked in that regard. The follow-up damage attack now deals physical damage instead of true damage. That I think is a minor factor. It's going to reduce his damage, of course, because everyone has a little bit of physical defense, but it's just one way to reduce his damage a little bit. The slow duration is decreased from 2.5 seconds to 1.5 seconds. That is very significant as well. Keep in mind that in late game this is a 25% slow, in early game it's 15%, so it's by no means a weak slow, and having it for that long was honestly pretty strong, especially since he also had the movement speed steal along with that. Now he will rely much more on the movement speed steal from his 1 and then getting close to enemy and applying that same movement speed steal again, which I think is fair. I think that should be his main slowing mechanic anyways. And last but not least, there is the ultimate, Piercing Moonlight. The damage mitigation on this ability, which is on the first part while you shoot the beams, is reduced from 50% to 30%. That is dangerous for Tsukuyomi because that means while he still has some mitigation and CC immunity, you can punish him a lot harder while he's still kind of trying to build up his damage at that point. At the same time, most players will currently use Aegis when getting fired on, so for those it won't really make a difference. So it depends more if you're like a tankier character that fights into him at that moment. The beam damage scaling is reduced from 20% to 15%, so 5% off each shot here. And the dash damage scaling is reduced from 55% to 50%, so another 5% off each shot here. That means the total scaling is decreased from 300% to 260% if you hit all the beams and all the dashes afterwards. The implications of that are very interesting, because the scaling is really not that much anymore, considering it takes quite a while to fire all that off. You could just use other abilities at the same time and reach the same scaling. The really strong part of the ability is now most definitely the base damage, which goes up to 1200 if you hit everything. That is still very, very high damage for an assassin, especially on a single target. And I'm a bit surprised that they didn't, instead of targeting these numbers, just reduce the numbers for successive hits on the same target. To me, the ability always seemed like it's meant to be used on multiple targets, and as such, if you are able to execute that, you should be rewarded, but if you just spam it on one target, you should be punished. But I guess that's not Hyra's perspective on this ability. At the same time, we have abilities that deal significantly more damage. Like Anubis' ultimate, for example, is at 1290 base damage and 450% magical scaling, which is higher damage in the first place, and enemies have less protections for that. So you can get a lot more damage than Tsukuyomi's ult now, but at the same time, he still has some mitigation and he still has the mobility while using it. So it will remain a strong ability. Now, of course, with so many nerfs, I have some thoughts of my own. But at this point, I'd like to hear from you guys how you feel about these nerfs. If you think this is not enough, too much, exactly the right amount, if you never want to see Tsukuyomi again so you don't really care if he's nerfed into the ground, or if you're playing him a lot and you may be unhappy with what's happening to him. I'm just generally curious what you guys are thinking. And of course, to offer you my perspective as well, I do think that the nerfs are quite drastic. I totally agree that Tsukuyomi needed more nerfs, and if you look at the damage numbers, they are always high at the end of the game. Most certainly needed to have some more fine-tuning there. But I do get the impression that he might be a little bit too weak after this. Ponpon is very convinced that he'll still be performing well, but I'm not quite sure. I think especially the knock-up immunity being removed from the 2 could be a pretty massive factor for him in some ways. And what I'm a little bit afraid of is that these changes or nerfs will push him more towards solo instead of jungle. Because as it is right now, you might want to max out the 1 first anyways, which works better in solo lane, and you might want to look for some defensive items, because otherwise you might not even survive through your own ultimate anymore, and you might get punished very hard if you get interrupted in your 2. And he still has the base values to make up for that. He still has high base values that allow him to go for a more bruiser style build, even though obviously the highest damage output will not come with that. I personally would have rather seen a shift towards lower base values while remaining on higher scaling levels, so that he would be able to perform well as a jungler and not too well as a solo laner, and that's not the situation for now at least. What I've also seen over the past week is that people were able to deal with him much better than many were initially. I saw a lot more effective usage of Aegis against him, which really countered this guy hard, because if his ult is completely shut down, that takes a lot of his damage away. And I saw people positioning better, using other counter items, and just also playing around the character's weaknesses and utilizing characters that work well against him. I am very curious to see where Tsukuyomi will land, and I personally am actually more interested in playing him now, because I found him boring and cheesy to play beforehand. There was just not very much effort going into that. Even though after the initial nerfs, he most certainly wasn't a free win in every game anymore. And yeah, I'm excited to find out what's going to happen, but I would not be surprised if he actually ends up not being played much at all anymore, because a lot of people just end up being disappointed with his current state and think that he's too weak. And then maybe over time we'll find some people that find out the right mechanics to still make him work effectively. But for now, I think that's a bit on the horizon still. I think it sounds a little bit too harsh. I think the other nerfs would have been fine while keeping the knock-up immunity on the 2. But we'll see. Maybe I'm just underestimating just how crazy he was as well. If you're interested in more Smite content and updates, feel free to hit the sub button and maybe the bell if you haven't yet. And also, I've had my videos hardly recommended to people outside of those who already watch as of late. So if you could click the like button, that would really help me out, because these interactions like significantly boost how much videos get seen or shared on YouTube or by YouTube as well. With that, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope to see you for the next one soon. Sloth out.